Hi everyone, here we are today. We're at the site of the old St. Peter's Church. Now this is a church that stood here from the 1880s until about 2 weeks ago when they started demolishing it. The work for the demolition is still ongoing and most of the rubble has already been taken away. But what I want to really tell you about is the grounds that St. Peter sits on and the forgotten history, some would say, of a cemetery that was located here. Now the founding of the burial ground goes back to Loyalist times, so 1783, and what a Loyalist is a British subject living in what is now the United States that wanted to fight or stay loyal to the crown and came here to Canada. So when the War of Independence ended, they came here to St. John and other places in the Maritimes and even back to England. In 1783 is when they founded a burial ground here on these grounds. That burial ground would then become known as the Indiantown burial ground. Indiantown gets its name from a trading post called Indian House. So the Malasee coming down the St. John River would trade there instead of having to go through the reversing falls, which you can imagine would have been quite difficult to do in a canoe given the incredibly fast flowing waters. So it was easier for them to set up Indian House trading post. It was already in an area that was an ancient portage route, and those people would have been trading with the locals in the area as well as people that would have been stationed up at Fort Howe. Now the founding of the cemetery goes back to 1783, but the burial grounds were being used up until roughly the 1850s, which predates the construction of the church, which only began in the 1880s. You can still see a excavator working away there, just taking away the last little bits of what remains of the old St. Peter's Church. Now, what I'd like to show you is this here. It's a memorial, because by now you've probably noticed that there's not many markers left around, not many headstones or tombstones around. I'm not sure when this was put here or why it still remains compared to all of the other stones, but it does refer to some names. So here we see in memory of Peter McNamara, who departed this life 28th of May 1837, age 60 years. This side too, also in the memory of his grandchildren, Bridget, daughter of Joseph and Bridget Martin, died August 1826, age 5 years. It's quite an old memorial. There's a lot of lichens growing on it with a skull and a priest holding the cross with the rosary. The Catholic Church bought this property specifically to make a Catholic church and to have Catholic burials. But there's reference to this area being for all denominations. So early on, when the Loyalists came, there may not have been that many Catholics around. By the time the 1880s, there was enough Catholics around that they wanted their own space. Here behind me is Douglas Avenue, and these are sandstone pillars that mark the extent of the church's property. At some point, some of the bodies were removed from the burial grounds and they were reinterred in Magazine Street. A few of the stones that were around in the 1880s, they were in such bad shape that you weren't able to actually read them, or they were completely moss covered. So it shows you that this area, even before the Catholic Church purchased the land, this burial ground was almost completely forgotten about. It also shows that having non-permanent markers was kind of the norm, at least in this cemetery, that not many of those stones remain, and most of the markers would have been just simple things that people could afford, like a wooden cross, and that not all unmarked graves would be nefarious. It appears that the construction company is digging some test pits in the old parking lot, seeing what they can find underneath. This here being the remains of the old St. Peter's Church, extending out, and then the old parking lot. This is the Divine Mercy Catholic School. It's a private school, and this is where the priests used to live. It's attached to St. Peter's Church, and this building, it was built after the construction of the church. We know that with the construction of the church, the foundations, they did find some bodies and they were moved. I haven't been able to find any evidence that they found any here, but we can assume possibly they did. We know that some bodies, they were moved out of this location or moved within this location, but we know that they have missed a few, because right here behind me in 2009, during construction work, they found a few bodies in and amongst this area. And then as we walk in behind to the rear of the school, we have another memorial erected by Julia Doolin to the memory of her husband, Michael Doolin, a native of Cloney, County of Cork, Ireland, who departed this life October 6, 1849. There's a few other names on there. We can assume that they were buried in and around this area. Not sure if they're still buried here. They could have been moved when they moved some of the bodies from the old burial grounds. This is the grotto, which has changed a lot. I've seen some historic photos and it was quite different. Right here behind me, this is where the Redemptorist priests are buried. Now the Redemptorist priests, they're a special order within the Catholic Church, and they are like missionaries. So these men, may have come to this area to do missionary work in the Maritime provinces and New Brunswick, St. John in particular, and they're buried here. There's around 46 Redemptorist priests that are buried in this burial ground. And if I look over here, maybe one of the oldest from 1890. So it gives you an idea of how long this place of burial has been used. An idea of the extent of the size of the old burial ground before the Catholic Church was built. It would have went from here, Clarendon Street, where we have that rock wall, down here, Douglas Avenue, into this wooded area. I'm in the area now that a tree fell and bones were exhumed with it, just showing that there are more than a few bodies that were left behind here or that were never found to be removed from this area. I'd like to read you a newspaper article from the 1880s. June 7th, 1883, newspaper, the Daily Telegraph, as transcribed by Daniel F. Johnson. Portland Burial Ground. The preparation for commencing work on the foundations of the new Catholic Church, Portland, are advancing rapidly. The site chosen for the new edifice is the old burial ground, situated about 100 feet back from Douglas Road and about the same distance from Main Street. There is ample room within the enclosure for both the church and the remains of those buried there. The burial ground was opened soon after the foundation of the city in 1783 and was used for the purpose of burying the dead sometime between 1840 and 1850. The last to find a resting place within the sacred pale was Patrick Powers, who died in 1854. Some years before this, the grounds were closed and a special act of assembly had to be passed to bury Mr. Powers in the graveyard. Rumors has it that at the opening of the burial ground, it was used by all denominations. But after a time, the Roman Catholic body secured the exclusive rights to the place. Occasionally, the descendants of those buried there visited the place. But as there were but few tombstones standing, it was difficult to locate any particular grave. In removing the soil preparatory to the building the foundation walls, a number of graves were opened. There was scarcely a coffin remaining intact, the wood having entirely rotted away. As the remains were found, they were carefully lifted, placed in the next box, and removed to another part in the burial ground. Several coffin plates were found intact. There are undoubtedly a large number of old tombstones in the graveyard, but they are so covered with moss to make the inscriptions almost illegible. The work of removing the dead is being done by Cornelius McCordy, who will also build the foundation wall of the new church. So as I was talking earlier about them digging test holes for the surveying, they have found human remains. So here, this small skull could be a child. These bones are the bones of our ancestors that date back to, from as far back as Loyalist times until the 1850s. And that's just one test pit. I would say the grounds around St. Peter's Church may be littered with the unmarked graves of former St. Johners. The excavators are now filling in those test pits, and the priest is coming to come and take these bones away, and they'll be reinterred somewhere else. So this is a face of a child, or maybe a small woman, an adult skull. Personally, I don't think this space should be developed any further until whoever becomes the property owner comes and does a geophys of the entire area and removes all of the unmarked graves here, and they're reinterred with respect somewhere else. It's really difficult to look at the tiny face of a fellow St. Johner that's been completely forgotten about. And I hope that now, with them coming and reinterring those bodies, they're able to finally rest in peace. So now that we're done here with the historic grounds of St. Peter's Church, we're going to go to the second location where bodies were taken from here and reinterred in another burial ground at Magazine Street. Now we're on Magazine Street, and behind me is Fort Howe. This here says St. Peter's Crescent. Now, this location here is of the original St. Peter's Church. Before the Catholic Church bought the property over here and moved this church to that location. Here there was a cemetery called St. Peter's Cemetery. Then there was a school built on this location. There was actually 3 schools in total. There was a boys' school, a girls' school, and then they joined those schools together. And then in 1949 is when they started to remove the bodies that were in this burial ground, and that's why today you might see these duplexes in an area that used to be a churchyard, a school, and a cemetery. This building behind me is a medical center. So during the construction of this building, they would have just bulldozed all this land over. I'm not sure if they found any human remains while during the construction of this building, but we do know that during the construction of this development, they did find some human remains. So these would have been bodies that never made the trip to the next cemetery in 1949. They would have been missed. Possibly they came from graves that didn't have a stone marking, so it would have been a wooden cross that may have fallen over, degraded over time. So they were missed, and they were found when they did the foundation work for this development. But what we do have is this, which is the remains of a grave marker. And I can only assume that this was pushed to this extreme back when they would have bulldozed this area over. There might be a few other ones over this hill, but it's all overgrown. Oh yeah, I can kind of see one here. But this would have been, you know, a pedestal. You would have a marker up here, most likely with someone's name written on it. And then we have a pin hole here. So that would have, you know, attached to the bottom part of this stone. So there were some bodies buried here, and unfortunately not all of them made the trip. There could possibly be more in and around the grounds here, but they just haven't been discovered yet. Now we're at St. Joseph's Cemetery on the east side of St. John. This is where the bodies from Indiantown Burial Ground moved to St. Peter's Cemetery on Magazine Street, were then moved to here. After some searching, I was able to find the location of the memorial to the people who were buried here from St. Peter's Cemetery. Now, there's many names on there, and they were buried here in a mass grave. But here, transferred from St. Peter's Cemetery, September 1st, 1949. And you might be wondering, well, how do I know that some of these bodies came from the Indiantown burial ground and then were placed at St. Peter's and then were brought here to St. Joseph's. Well, I know that because of this man here, James Collins, medical doctor. He was one of the doctors on Partridge Island who died on Partridge Island, was buried in the Indiantown burial ground, moved to St. Peter's Cemetery, and then moved again here. So we know at least a few of these names probably came from the Indiantown burial ground to St. Peter's and then here. Gilroy, McGowan. I recognize some names of people that, you know, families, Flood family, Fleming. These are names that still, you know, live in our community, still are here. And I feel quite ashamed that at the Indian ground burial grounds, there's bodies there that have been forgotten, not on purpose, but over the ages. People, they don't know that their ancestors are there. And now, I don't know how the politics work, how the demolition of these historic buildings can take place in our city. But after you see a small skull looking back at you of someone who there's no record, we'll never be able to trace who that person was. Any of those bodies that are buried there, if the record exists, I haven't been able to see it. It may be with the Catholic Church. Unlikely, I would say, seeing how they were buried there almost 100 years before the church was constructed. But I hope that after watching this, the people of St. John, they remember who's buried at the Indiantown burial ground, at the foundations of the old St. Peter's Church, which no longer exists anymore, except for in the memory of the people who went there, lived here, and in some of the video and pictures that people have taken. To give a little bit of context to scale, the size of the Indiantown burial ground compared to the Loyalist burial ground would have been this large. The potential there was thousands of bodies, and by the amount of names on there, on this memorial, I wouldn't say that they got them all. But I hope that the bodies that are there, whoever takes over that property, either they never develop that land or they do geophys and those bodies are brought to somewhere, maybe here, and reinterred with the respect that they really deserve. Thanks for watching.